How do you destroy an empire your father spent his whole life building? You could lose a war, you could go bankrupt, or you could do it the way one man on this list did. He inherited a brand new, undefeated empire of tens of millions and wiped it out in 3 years, without a single foreign enemy. Welcome to Ranked History, where we rank the past so you don't have to repeat it. Today, the bottom 5 royal heirs who ruined everything. The rules. 1. They had to inherit a strong hand. Nobody gets blamed for boarding a sinking ship. 2. We rank the gap between what they got and what they left. 3. The ruin has to be their own work. Bad luck doesn't count. Bad decisions do. Number 5. Edward II of England. His father was Edward I, 6'2", terrifying, called the Hammer of the Scots. He left his son the best war machine in Western Europe, a cowed nobility, and one job: finish Scotland. Edward II's actual interests were rowing, thatching roofs, and digging ditches. Which, fine, healthy hobbies. The chroniclers were scandalized anyway. The real problem was that he handed the entire government to his favorites. First Piers Gaveston, who got himself murdered by the barons. Then the Despensers, who were worse. They ran the kingdom like a protection racket, and Edward let them. In 1314, he finally marched on Scotland with one of the largest armies England had ever sent north. At Bannockburn, a much smaller Scottish force pushed it into a stream and took it apart. The Hammer of the Scots' son, beaten by the people his father had spent 20 years hammering. By 1326, his own wife, Isabella, invaded England with a small army. She didn't need a big one. The kingdom simply joined her. In January 1327, Edward became the first anointed English king ever deposed. He died in prison that September. The famous red-hot poker story? Later legend, almost certainly invented. The deposition was real enough. Number 4. King John. Yes, the Robin Hood villain. The real one was worse. He inherited the Angevin Empire. England, Normandy, Anjou, Aquitaine. His brother was Richard the Lionheart, which is a hard act to follow, but the job was mostly, don't drop it. He dropped it. By 1204, Normandy was gone, the homeland of William the Conqueror himself, lost to the King of France in under 2 years. His own contemporaries nicknamed him Soft Sword. 1204, by the way, was a rough year for empires. It's the same year those Crusader debt collectors from our last episode were burning Constantinople. Then it gets worse. John spent a decade squeezing England with taxes to buy Normandy back, built a grand coalition, and watched it get flattened at Bouvines in 12,114. The barons had now paid for 2 lost empires. They rebelled, cornered him at Runnymede, and made him seal Magna Carta, the charter that put it in writing that even the king is under the law. John's response? He got the Pope to annul it within weeks and plunged England into civil war. The barons were so done with him, they invited a French prince to be king instead. John died mid-war, of dysentery, days after his baggage train, the story goes, crown jewels included, sank in the tidal marshes of the Wash. Even his luggage abandoned the campaign. Number 3. Ferdinand VII of Spain. Spain in 1808 still ran a global empire, most of 2 American continents, gold, silver, the works. Ferdinand's contribution began with handing his crown to Napoleon, not losing it, handing it. Napoleon summoned him to a meeting in Bayonne, and Ferdinand walked in, argued with his own father over who got to abdicate, and let Napoleon collect the crown like a coat at the door. Spain then fought 6 brutal years to get him back. They called him El Deseado, the desired one. Deseado returns in 1814 and immediately abolishes the constitution his people had written while fighting for him, restores the Inquisition, and starts jailing the very liberals who had bled to bring him home. Spanish historians ended up with a different nickname, the Felon King. Meanwhile, the American colonies had spent those 6 years governing themselves and discovered they liked it. Ferdinand's answer was reconquest, underfunded armies, shipped across an ocean into a decade of losing. By 1825, after Ayacucho, mainland Spanish America was gone. An empire 3 centuries old, dissolved in one reign. For an encore, he rewrote the succession rules in favor of his infant daughter, and the argument over that exploded into the Carlist civil wars the moment he died. Inherited a world empire. Left one exhausted country and a war about his daughter. Number 2. Commodus. For almost a century, Rome's emperors had picked their heirs by adoption. Find the most competent man available, train him, hand over. It gave Rome the stretch historians call the 5 good emperors. Then, Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor, broke the streak for the one reason philosophy can't argue with. He had a son. Commodus inherited Rome at its height in 180 AD, and simply stopped doing the job. Wars were settled quickly so he could get home to the games. Government went to favorites who sold offices like market stalls. When money ran short, he found a new revenue stream: treason trials against rich senators, followed by confiscation. And then he decided he was Hercules. He fought in the arena hundreds of times, over 700 if you believe the count his own court put about, against opponents armed with wooden weapons, and billed the city a fortune per appearance. The historian Cassius Dio was in the Senate the day Commodus killed an ostrich, walked over, and waved its head at the senators. Dio says they had to chew laurel leaves to keep from laughing, because laughing meant dying. He renamed the months after himself, all 12. He renamed Rome itself, Colonia Commodiana. On the last day of 192, his own court had him strangled by his wrestling coach, which at least stayed on brand. Dio, who lived through it, wrote that Rome had passed from a kingdom of gold to one of iron and rust. The next year, 5 different men claimed the throne, and the Praetorian Guard auctioned the empire to the highest bidder. The Golden Age didn't fade. It was canceled. Number 1. Hu Hai, the second emperor of Qin. His father was Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor, the man who ended centuries of warring states and unified China for the first time in history. Roads, writing, weights, and measures, one empire from the steppe to the sea. Then, in 210 BC, he died on the road. And the empire's fate came down to a carriage, a corpse, and 2 men who could forge a signature. The court eunuch Zhao Gao and the chancellor faked the emperor's will. The story, and here our main source is the historian Sima Qian, writing a century later, is that they hid the death, ordered a cart of rotting fish to ride beside the imperial carriage to mask the smell, and sent the real heir, the capable eldest son Fusu, a forged order to kill himself. He obeyed. The throne went to the youngest son instead, Hu Hai, about 20 years old, chosen precisely because he'd be easy to control. Khwarezm, from our last episode, at least needed Genghis Khan to show up before it collapsed. Hu Hai needed no help at all. The new emperor's first project was security, meaning he executed his own siblings, princes and princesses both, so no rival could ever replace him. Then he doubled down on his father's mega projects: the tomb, the palaces, the walls. More conscription, more taxes, from a population already at breaking point. Officials who brought bad news were punished, so in a move that will shock no one who's ever had a bad manager, the bad news simply stopped arriving. Zhao Gao, meanwhile, ran a loyalty test that became a Chinese proverb. He presented the court with a deer and called it a horse. Whoever said deer was marked for death. An empire where calling a deer is fatal has, at that point, stopped being governable. In 209 BC, 2 conscripted farmers started the revolt. Within months, the old kingdoms Qin had conquered were all back in arms. In 207 BC, Zhao Gao forced Hu Hai to kill himself. Weeks later, the capital surrendered, and within months, its palaces were ash. 3 years. The first empire in Chinese history, the largest inheritance any heir on this list ever received. Gone, without one foreign invader crossing the border. The bottom 5, Edward II lost his army and his throne. John lost half an empire and his luggage. Ferdinand lost a continent. Commodus canceled a golden age. And Hu Hai erased the biggest inheritance on this list in 3 years. None of them were unlucky. They chose favorites, flattery, and fantasy instead. Tell me in the comments which heir I missed next time. the advisors who did the ruining themselves. Subscribe. Unlike Commodus, I promise not to rename the channel after myself.